Welcome to the Reverie Nature Podcast. I'm your host, Chad Clifford, and today we're continuing the journey into the fascinating world of animal tracking with part 2. Last week we delved into some of the best reference books for tracking, providing you with invaluable resources to enhance your knowledge and skills. So this week we're shifting our focus to the tracking kit that every novice tracker should bring along. In the Reverie Nature Podcast, you can expect to find a wide variety of topics on the nature experience, from bushcraft, survival skills, nature lore, animal tracks and sign, storytelling, nature soundscapes, and much more. These are the lessons and skills I've been teaching for decades. So before we dig in, please take a moment to subscribe and consider offering your support to the podcast. If you bring nothing else on your hikes, especially in the wintertime, at least have a camera or your phone that takes photographs and something you can put beside a track, an object to give you a reference of size. Because if you do not, later on it is going to be very difficult to identify this track for you or anyone else. So keep that in mind. I've taken thousands of photographs of animal tracks in all types and conditions and weather. And when I was taking photographs, I was using slide film, and you had to adjust the shutter speed and whatnot because taking pictures or photographs of tracks in the wintertime is very difficult. You have bright white snow in a lot of cases with a track that's a little darker. So you needed to adjust the shutter speed, and otherwise your photographs would always wash out or whatnot. It's a lot easier today. Your phone probably can adjust for this on its own without you having to adjust shutter speeds or whatnot. And even after the fact, you can probably edit it to get a nice clear photograph. So, settings on cameras isn't a concern like it used to be. However, here's a really good animal tracking tip and also a good tip for taking photographs. Tracking is much easier when the sun is not overhead. When the sun's high in the sky, it washes out the tracks. There's no shadows. If you consider every track is a dent, not always, but usually it's a dent in the ground. What happens is the sun, when it's low, it casts a shadow, or the indent in the ground is a shadow. When the sun is high, you don't get that shadow. Much harder to see, much harder to photograph. So keep that in mind, even with the modern cameras, that the lower the sun, the better that track is going to pop out for you. And even in the wintertime too, of course. And you might be wondering from my mention that usually tracks are dents in the ground, but not always the case. Now, imagine you're tracking in the wintertime and you come across some tracks where in the snow substrate, these tracks are actually sticking out. They're not dents in the snow, they're sticking out of the snow. They're the bumps sticking out of the ground. This occurs when a track is made, it compresses the snow, and when that snow is compressed, it takes longer to melt than the fluffy snow around it. So as the sun in the springtime or on a nice warm day lowers the snow, these compacted areas actually remain as little islands. And that's how you have tracks that aren't actually dents in the ground. They're actually raised up. You see this on lake ice quite a bit. But let's now switch back to what you should bring when you're learning to track. Well, I'm not going to do this in any particular order except for the idea of bringing a camera. And so the rest of these items, you can decide what you might want to bring. I always brought all of it, and this kit I'm about to describe would fit into a waist fanny pack, not a large one. So a fanny pack that would typically fit a medium-sized camera. Let's start with plaster. Plaster for tracks. Where do you get plaster for tracks? Consider Plaster of Paris. It is the so-called mud that contractors put on drywall to fill in those cracks. So go to your hardware store, get some Plaster of Paris, and I typically would use an empty milk bag. I'd fill that half full with plaster of Paris. I would bring a second milk bag to mix the plaster of Paris in. And this is just wonderful. When you come across a really good track, often in the mud or dried mud perhaps, you can pour this plaster in there and wait for 20 minutes depending on your mixture, and you'll have a nice cast of that track. There's a lot of things to talk about with plaster tracks, so let me just give you some advice. With that second bag, what I do, if it's a smaller track, I pour some of the plaster of Paris into the empty bag, and I slowly add water. And I want a mixture to be like porridge. I don't want it runny at all. Even a very thick mixture will seep into the finest detail of a track. Other than that, when I'm preparing a track for the plaster to come in, I want the plaster of Paris to be about as thick as 1 inch on the base of it, and then the track protrudes from there. So what I'll do is I'll just find some sticks and I'll make a little frame around the track, and I'll leave a good inch all the way around, so the track's not right on the edge where it could break later. So with these little sticks, I make a little picture frame around the track. I might add a little bit of mud. The plaster's pretty good at not seeping out too much. You don't have to be too specific here or too detailed. Anyway, so I have a little frame around the track. I pour in that plaster of Paris, and the reason I have it nice and thick is that it will dry more quickly. I can generally get a track to dry in about 15 minutes. Good enough for transport anyway. And even after a longer time, if you have it, to let that track or plaster of Paris set, you want to be very careful digging it up. You don't want to just kind of grab the plaster and pull it out with your hands. What I do is I take a stronger stick, and I dig beneath that track to try and lift the soil with the track out of the ground. And then later, very gently dust off that dirt, because your plaster's still setting, and it'd be very easily to break a piece off at this point. Okay, time for a story. So I was with a group of young people. They were wilderness camping, and I was taking them on a tracking walk. It was in the summertime. So I took them to where the tracks were more obvious, by a wetland area with lots of mud. And sure enough, we came across some great tracks. And I had them plaster the tracks, and they mixed their own mixtures, and it's very easy to add too much water, just like baking or anything else. So a lot of the mixtures were a little watery, but they poured the tracks, and I knew these were going to take a while to dry. So the group went ahead with the day's hike, and I stayed behind, which I figured would be about an hour, waiting for these plaster casts to dry. And I was quite a ways back in the woods at this point. And interesting enough, I was sitting there, just what I do sometimes when plaster is drying, on the underside, the top of your little plaster pile here that you poured into the ground, that will be the underside of your track later. So sometimes I'll make little designs in the plaster as it's drying, just out of boredom kind of thing. And so this is what I was doing. I was putting the names of the people who'd poured the track I was scribing it into the plaster as it was drying. And about 20 minutes in, and not too far behind me, and this was really thick brush, this loud grunt and growl, I guess, emerged. It was like close. It was only like 20 meters away, if that. And I'm pretty sure it was a bear. And I heard no twig snapping. It was a quiet day. And I think what had happened, we marched in there, and the bear, I think, just remained quiet as we had this group of people all making these plaster tracks. And that's unusual. I think we must have caught the bear sleeping or something, because they're usually long gone by the time people are anywhere near. Black bears, of course. And yeah, so holy cow, that's close. And so anyway, that was enough. So I grabbed all the tracks kind of hastily, put them in my bag, and off I went. That was the only sound I heard. I didn't hear the animal walk or whatnot. But you know how you can tell the size of the animal by its grunt or growl and how deep and loud it is? Yeah, this was a rumble. I'm pretty sure it was a black bear. So anyway, that's one interesting story. When you're quiet and in the woods, all kinds of things start to come out when you're not making noise. And I think that grunt and growl, it was just trying to figure out if I was even still there in the area. I think it was curious because I was sitting there quiet for 20 minutes, no sound, and the bear was, I guess, getting impatient, waiting or hiding. And anyway, that was a fun tracking story when plastering tracks. I still have a bunch of plaster tracks, that I have from years ago tracking, and they're a nice little keepsake and a really fun activity for kids. So get into plaster tracking, even practice on your dog. Take your dog to a beach with wet sand, find a nice track, make a nice plaster track, get some practice in before you get out there. Of course, plaster does add a lot of weight to your bag, but you don't have to bring a lot of it. I tend to bring enough for the largest animal that I'll come across, because sometimes you just might come across a really nice moose track. Other times it could be a nice clear bear track that you really want to grab. So you need enough plaster to fill a big track like that. So you do need a fair bit of it. Let's move on now. Another item in that tracking kit should be a flashlight. And I'm not talking about a little AAA battery size flashlight. I want a good strong flashlight. And this isn't for being out at night tracking at all. This is for coming across, especially in the wintertime, coming across little holes in the snow or little cavities or caves. And you'll come across these all the time because animals are in and out of these things all the time. So you want a flashlight that does offer a good beam. You want some good light coming out of this thing, because when your pupils are dilated or they're adjusting to the bright conditions of snow and winter, it's really hard to see in these cavities. So you need a really good light to check out these little areas, because you will find some interesting finds that are tucked away in such spots. The next thing in your tracking kit should be cue cards. Yes, those 3x5 cue cards. And I would have, I don't know how many cue cards I'd carry, but it'd be about...
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Calling all nature rebels and podcast aficionados, I hope you're enjoying today's podcast episode. Why not help ignite the flames of our wild community by leaving a rating and review right now? Your words are the sparks that fuel our journey. Likewise, share the Reverie Nature podcast across your social networks like the spreading branches of an ancient tree. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in wildness is the preservation of the world. Now let's get back to the podcast. The thickness of a deck of cards, or maybe a little thicker. And what I would have on these cue cards is each species that I think I would come across, mice, voles, shrews, the different weasels. On each cue card, I would have all the details I could put in there, a condensed version on these cue cards about these animals. I would draw pictures of what their tracks should look like. I would have their habitat. I would write down things like each individual foot size, and I'd get these from my reference books. And so when you're out there, you use these cue cards to help you decide what you're seeing. But you know what I actually use these cue cards for more? When I was at work, I would often just have them in my lunch kit or even in my pocket. And when I'd take a little break, some coffee, I'd just flip through these cue cards and I'd start to memorize the things that were on there. All these little tidbits of information that you come across. So having cue cards, both as a exercise in memory to get you more familiar with these different animals, and also when you're out there, instead of bringing a heavy resource book, you have the information on a cue card. Now, another thing you should bring, and I already mentioned this, is a ruler. A 6-inch ruler is great, just about the right size, and it's convenient. I just so have happened to have made my own ruler. It's called a tracking tool, or animal tracking tool. And it is a 8-inch ruler, and I have all this important information on it besides the scale. And I use inches. I'm old school. But, I guess I should modify this to be metric. It's actually in the works, having a metric ruler as well. But what I do have on this animal tracking tool is I have 3 columns of text. And one is, it might not make sense what I'm talking about right now, but I have the animals and their trail widths divided up by the way they walk. If they are diagonal walkers and the resulting track pattern, if they bound, typically, or if they're little gallopers like mice and squirrels. So on this tracking ruler, I have a very quick reference guide to doing a very quick measure on animal tracks and having the resource needed to identify it to a species level. I'll be getting into how to do this. This is a really important tip for you for another episode. But anyway, I'll have that tracking ruler because it's just a great resource on there. It's from doing this for decades and realizing what you really need to learn the tracks. And again, it's not about just identifying it to a species. It's nice to know, but it's about the observation and just seeing what they're up to. That's important. I also have a bunch of photographs on my animal tracking tool. Across the bottom, I have actual photographs of really good examples of different animal tracks. Besides a ruler, measuring tape is pretty important too. I used to bring just a small steel measuring tape. And the reason you'd need a measuring tape is for how long the distance between strides are, or between tracks that an animal makes. This is often a good indicator to help you identify it to a species level. However, I don't really think you need that so much. There's lots of ways to help you identify tracks without using this. When I was learning, I was taking all the measurements every book would give me, condensing it, and I'd be able to measure individual track sizes and the strides and the distances it would hop or run. And I'd take all these things into consideration. So having a measure tape was essential. Not only that, what I would bring was a caliper. For taking measurements of internal diameters and depths, there's a thing called a caliper. Sometimes people use a dial caliper, but it's taken precise measurements, and it was especially handy because it has these little tangs that slide, and you could kind of put those within the track, the depression in the ground, and measure that way. Yeah, it's good to have. I think when I teach animal tracks now, I don't typically advise people to bring that kind of stuff. It's a little overkill. However, that's how I learned initially, was taking all these accurate measurements. And in doing so, this will help you solve a lot of mysteries out there. I think I mentioned in the first episode, I have mysteries that have gone on for over a decade, animal tracks, and it was by those precise measurements, measuring the size of feet, that solved the mystery later. I'm thinking of one instance in particular with crow and raven tracks. I didn't know what a certain track pattern was, or not the pattern so much, but what this bird track was. I didn't know what species it was from. And later, I read a piece of information that described a group of birds that made this type of track. And without getting into the details, the only thing I was missing was the size. I did not have any good reference to how big the track was, and I could have got it down to the species level if I had taken better, detailed notes on my tracks. Speaking of detailed notes, that's another thing you need to bring: a small pad of paper and pencil. Maybe a pen. I like pencils because you can add shading and you can sharpen the pencil. So when your ink dries out or just is stubborn in your pen, pencils are the way to go. Every good naturalist should probably have a journal. Well, this can be your tracking journal, but keep it small. It has to be packable. And if it's packable, you'll be more likely to bring it. And you will use it. You'll be sketching. In fact, one of the best ways to learn about animal tracks, and I'll get into this in another episode, is by drawing a track. The more time you spend staring at those minute details, Man, I tell you, you do that a few times, and those minute details that took you maybe 20 minutes to see while you were drawing it will pop out at you later. You're going to be a much better tracker if you start drawing animal tracks. Never mind just taking photographs and looking at them later. No, when you start drawing things, you pick up those details, as any artist will tell you. So there you go. Tracking can be an art form, and of course it is. So let's move on to something else now. Well, maybe I better spend a bit more time on note-taking. So you need your notepad just to take the notes. If you want, and you probably should do this, is take into consideration the weather. So in other words, journal the day, the time, the weather, the conditions, recent weather, all these things, especially if you keep a detailed daily journal. Keeping track of the weather patterns throughout a winter or summer will really help you do things like aging tracks later. Because when you come across a track and you know what the weather has been, for the last week, month, or year, it's going to tell you how that track was aged and what you can expect to see in that track based on the weather. So whether your journal that you take with you or your notepad that you take with you on tracking trips, you probably don't want to take all those details, but this should be in maybe your tracking journal at home. But for when you're out there, definitely taking sketches and making notes to help you solve that mystery later when you get home with your resource books. And we're almost done here, but I just want to go over what we already talked about. We talked about bringing some plaster, which is a fun activity for kids. It is hard to come across a good track. So you're going to don't expect to just go out for a tracking walk and find a great track. You'll see pretty quickly that you need a great track before it'll really turn out in the plaster. So you need to have it with you all the time. Your flashlight, your cue cards, your ruler and measuring tape. Forget the camera, and a notepad and pencil. So what else can we bring? How about some small Ziploc bags and some tape? Why? Well, if you're collecting things, you want little baggies to store them in. And tape, you could be collecting hairs and just sticking it on the tape, putting it in the bag, and other evidence that you find along the way. Now, you probably don't want to be collecting scat, and if you do, for identification later or showing someone else, people do this kind of stuff. You got to be very careful with scat. Don't go near dried out scat. There's molds that can grow on there, and you don't want to be breathing that stuff in, so that it's this dangerous stuff really to be playing with, obviously. So research that if you're going to bother doing that. I don't tend to collect scat. However, there have been people who have made necklaces out of scat, pieces of scat, yes. And if you are one of those people, I'll let you look into the details on safety here. But what some people do, they take those compact little rabbit pellets and the deer pellets and moose pellets, porcupine pellets, all those herbivores that tend to eat things, and their scat, depending on the time of year, would come out in nice little nugget sizes, just ideal for a little necklace, a little pearl necklace of scat. And of course, they'd treat the scat with whatever it was, liquid plastic or whatever, to seal it up properly. But anyway, you do have health concerns if you're going to mess with scat. Stay away from it, observe it, and we'll get into a lot of insight you can learn from the scat in another episode. But certainly for hair, and maybe even little jawbones and stuff like that you come across, there's a lot of little keepsakes you might come across. Owl pellets, if you don't know what those are, we'll talk about those later. Anyway, you just got to be careful when you're collecting and handling stuff. Obviously, I won't get into hygiene here. What else can you bring? How about a magnifying glass? When you're looking at tracks closer, you're looking at hair or scrapings on a tree, magnifying glasses are wonderful. So bring a little magnifying glass or loop. I like to bring one that's 2 by 4 inches, that kind of size. But you can bring smaller ones, but it's just nice to, especially for kids, right? Get right in there, teach them to go look really close at things. And when you're drawing tracks too, definitely use a magnifying glass. So have that in your kit as well. You'll be surprised how often you use it if you have it. And that about does it for what I consider to be great in an Animal Tracks kit. Like I said, I would store all of these things, including cue cards, and it will fit into a 1 liter fanny pack. 1 liter fanny pack, if you're not sure how big 1 liter would be, that's about the size of the smaller fanny packs you'll see, not those big ones. You don't want to have something big and bulky. Ordinarily, when I'm doing an Animal Tracks lecture, an introductory one, these are the kind of things I'd talk about. In other words, the things to bring at the end of the talk. But because this series is going to be ongoing, we're going to have lots of good insight into Animal Tracks and how to learn how to track. I just wanted to get this out of the way now so you don't have to wait till much later. You need to get out there tracking right away, all right? So as we move forward in this series, there might be some other topics that I cover unrelated to tracking in between. I like to mix things up a little bit, but I guarantee there'll be lots more on Animal Tracks and tracking. It's been a major hobby of mine for a very long time, and you will find, of course, when you get better at Animal Tracks and tracking, all these things I talked about, the little tracking kit that I would bring, you don't need those later. You're going to come across tracks, and not that you need to identify things, but you're going to pick up on stuff very quickly. You're not going to need to measure stuff anymore. You'll just know by the size of what you're seeing what it is. However, you're always going to find great things to take photographs of, and bringing that flashlight and even the magnifying glass is not a bad idea. Thank you for joining us on the Reverie Nature Podcast. Remember to subscribe for more captivating episodes exploring the wonders of the natural world. Until next time, may you saunter forth embracing nature's song, and may the whispers of the wilderness linger in your heart.
And floating above the forest where a canopy has turned upside